Thank you. Hello, everybody. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the Chair of Christian Thought lecture series. My name is Jacqueline Jenkins, and I'm a professor of medieval literature and head of the Department of English at the University of Calgary. And I'll be your host for tonight, moderating this event. We'll start with a little bit of housekeeping, and then I will turn it over. We'll begin the event proper. So just for a moment, if you'll bear with me, I would ask you, of course, to mute yourselves. And if you wish to ask a question at any point today, we invite you to type that question into the question and answer, the Q&A box on the Zoom template. We expect that the talk will take about 40 minutes, and we'll follow that with about 20 minutes of questions. So there'll be plenty of time to get to as many questions as we can. And we appreciate your patience if we're not able to get to them all. Also, I should note that the event is being recorded, just so you're aware. And as we begin, I will turn over at the start to Monique Riel, who's a student in the Ancient and Medieval History program at the University of Calgary, to offer our land acknowledgement.
We would like to acknowledge the stories of the people of the Treaty 7 Southern, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Siksika, the Piikani, and the as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation and Lakota, including the Chiniki, Bearpaw, and Wesley First Nations. This territory is all home to Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3.
Thank you, Monique. Well, it's my absolute pleasure to introduce Professor Carolyn Muessig to you tonight. Since the 1st of July in 2020, Professor Muessig holds the Chair of Christian Thought in the Department of Classics and Religion at the University of Calgary. And for the 25 years previous to that, she taught in the Department of Religion and Theology at the University of Bristol in the UK. At various times during her years at Bristol, she served as head of department, as director of Bristol's Institute for Research in the Humanities and Arts, and as co-director of the Centre for Medieval Studies. Her work has focused on the history of stigmata, on monastic education and medieval preaching. In 2020, Professor Muessig published The Stigmata in Medieval and Early Modern Europe with Oxford University Press, an important study of the emergence of the stigmata as physically manifested signs in the 13th century with St. Francis of Assisi, and its role in the cultural identities and experiences of later medieval religious men and women. Her earlier books addressed sermons, preachers, and audiences in the Middle Ages, which was the title of her 2012 book, or Medieval Monastic Preaching, again, the title of her 1998 book. In addition to these monographs, Professor Muessig's scholarly work has included critical editions and translations of Hildegard of Bingen's writing or Jacques de Vitry's sermons, for instance, as well as a number of edited and co-edited collections of essays on a range of medieval religious topics. Professor Muessig is currently working on a project that investigates female preachers and their sermons in late medieval and early modern Europe, scholarship which informs the talks this week. And tonight's lecture is titled Spiritus Domini before Pope Francis, Women as Spiritual Advisors in Medieval Italy. Now I invite you all in your various homes to join me in welcoming Professor Carolyn Muessig.
Well, thank you so much, Jackie. And it's nice to finally get to meet you and look forward to meeting you in the flesh as soon as this is possible. Thank you all for coming tonight. I really appreciate that. I am going to share my screen here and look at, just have a bit of a PowerPoint to help me remember what I'm going to say. And I recently came across some writing and articles about Spiritus Domini, which is an apostolic letter that Pope Francis circulated on the 10th of January, 2021. And it caught my eye. A few things caught my eye. The first thing, the Spiritus Domini addresses the ministries of Lecter and Acolytes and in relation to women, and it permits women to hold these positions that respectively deal with the ministry of the word and the ministry of the altar. But what I'd like to discuss, I don't want to really talk about the ministries per se here. I just want to dwell a little bit on Pope Francis's comments and ideas of the role of women in the contemporary church, just very briefly. And having seen this article and responses to Spiritus Domini, I started looking around a bit about what else Pope Francis has said about the role of women. And in 2019, there was a synod that dealt with the Pan-Amazon region. And he raised an issue which I felt the way he put it was really very compelling about the role women played in keeping Catholicism alive, or in fact introducing Catholicism to the region. So he said, in the Amazon region, there are communities that have long preserved and handed on the faith, even though no priest has come their way, even for decades. And this could happen because of the presence of strong, generous women who, undoubtedly called and prompted by the Holy Spirit, baptized, catechized, prayed, and acted as missionaries. For centuries, women have kept the church alive in those places through their remarkable devotion and deep faith. And also, on the same day as Spiritus Domini was released, Pope Francis released another letter that gave a bit more context and I guess explained his motivation a little bit more of why he released Spiritus Domini. And he says, one small segment of this letter, he says, one feels ever greater today the urgency to rediscover the co-responsibility of all the baptized in the church, and particularly the mission of the laity. So it was these different elements, but in particular, the focus on 4th century, so women of the past, and also this notion of co-responsibility that really caught my attention, because it made me think exactly about the research that Jackie just mentioned, that I'm looking at the role of women as religious educators and preachers in the medieval church. And a lot of these points raised in these letters resonated, especially that term co-responsibility. It enabled me to understand, or to give a name to, what I'm looking at in the Middle Ages. So we're going from the present, to 2021, into the 14th century. And I'd like to talk about co-responsibility in 14th century Italy in relation to 3 particular women: Angela of Foligno, Clare of Montefalco, and Margaret of Faenza. Now, I don't want you to think that I'm limited about the women I could talk about in regards to co-responsibility and their roles in the medieval church. Actually, I'm spoiled for choice. I could easily talk about the Beguines from the 13th century Low Countries, or Belgium, modern day France, that flourished, a large women's movement, some have called it. Very much lay women who are very much involved in religious expression, being spiritual mothers to priests, a very interesting group of women. I could also talk about, for instance, the German nuns of Helfta in the late 13th century and early 14th century, who were extremely well educated, great mystics as well as theologians. The two aren't mutually exclusive, of course, but there's a lot of choices I had to make, and I figured in a brief talk I only could pick 3, and these are the 3 that I have chosen, but there are many others. So let's consider co-responsibility. And in regards to the women I'm looking at, it's very much associated with these terminologies: vernacular theology and communities of discourse. And these are terms that have been introduced in the last, well, I guess about 20, 25 years into the study of interactions that I'll be talking about tonight. The vernacular theology, or communities of discourse, is a notion of it's facilitated a dialogue wherein men and women, clerics and lay people shared their religious aspirations. So it could take place within a monastery, or it could take place in a church, or even in somebody's home. But it was, I would say, inclusive. And it didn't necessarily mean that clerics didn't speak to lay people and women didn't speak to men. It was a mutually inclusive discourse. Very often it focused on ideas of the relationship of the soul with God, what we might term mystical discourse as well. Or it could talk about just spiritual insights in general. So sometimes it's easier to indicate what something is by contrasting with what it isn't. And so very often vernacular theology is contrasted with scholastic theology, which is viewed as a systematic study of the Bible, of dogma and theology and the church fathers, as well as the application of Aristotelian logic to theology. And it's written by very learned trained theologians in Latin. And to be simplistic, I guess one could say that on the face of it, that it's more exclusive because it's usually takes place within restricted areas of institutions such as the University of Paris, studia that would consist of men who were mainly clerics. So I guess that's a good contrast. So this notion of vernacular theology, scholars such as Nicholas Watson, Eliana Corbari, and of course Bernard McGinn, who was here in December, referred to vernacular theology too in his work in regards to mystical discourse between men and women. So I think that's a term of co-responsibility, maybe a sort of co-responsibility term that we see in the Middle Ages, and I'll be reflecting on that. So the first person I'll look at is Angela of Foligno. And she was a wife and mother, and there really is no easy way to say this. And I feel I have to mention it because if you haven't read about Angela of Foligno and you go off to read about this woman, and then you find out that there is a very shocking aspect to her religious life, is that she was a wife and mother. And she wanted to lead a religious life. And she indicates to us that she actually prayed for the death of her family so she could enter into religious devotion. And within quick succession, her husband, her mother, and her children die. And, there's explanations of, it would be very difficult for a woman in the Middle Ages to have a family and be very devoted to religious vocation of some sort. But no matter how you slice it, it is a very difficult and shocking aspect of Angela of Foligno. And people are very contradictory. And this is something I guess we just have to keep in mind as we look at other aspects of Angela that are more appealing. She became a Franciscan tertiary, that is a layperson who follows the teachings of Francis of Assisi. Foligno is not very far from Assisi, and Francis of Assisi was a 13th century holy man who captured the imagination not only of the Italian peninsula, but really across Western Europe. With his dedication to voluntary poverty, helping those in need, and his deep appreciation for creation in general and beauty. Many people followed in his footsteps, and Angela Foligno was one of them. She was very much influenced by Francis of Assisi, and in fact divested herself of her riches when she converted to this Franciscan way of life. We know about Angela a lot through the Memorial, which is a biographical and theological treatise that has come down to us. And what was very common in the Middle Ages, it wasn't usual for women to write their biographies at this time in the 13th century. And what she did is she dictated her life to a scribe, Brother A. We know he was a Franciscan, but we don't know his name. We think that he may have been a relative, but he wrote down the memorial that Angela dictated. There's a very complicated, complex, debated history of the way this Angela's book has come down to us, but suffice it to say that I would simplify it by simply saying that Brother A and Angela's engagement in the memorial, where she dictates her insights and understanding to Brother A, and he copies it down and struggles sometimes, quite frankly, to understand what she's saying, what she means. He reads it back to her. She says, no, you didn't quite get that right. So it's a real community of discourse. I think the memorial itself is representative of this whole idea of the community of discourse. Now, the reason why some of you may have, if you're lucky enough to have gone to Assisi, may recognize the Basilica of St. Francis of Assisi right here. That's the image that you see. And Angela had some kind of mystical crisis. When she went on pilgrimage to Assisi to go to the tomb of Francis, this man that people venerated, still do. And there she had some kind of mystical crisis, broke down weeping and screaming the same words, love unknown, why? In fact, we know that Brother A was there. He was absolutely mortified, we're told, by her actions, and was completely embarrassed by it, and told her at that point, don't come back to Assisi, this is an embarrassment. But he evidently gets over that, because he's intrigued to find out, what is it that she experienced, and he wants to learn from her, and that's how the memorial comes about. So Angela of Foligno, as I say, I'm not really going to be talking so much about their teachings, but really how they were perceived as being responsible for the church and on some level, and also how they may perceive themselves as being co-responsible. And in the case of Angela, we do have some insights into how she perceived herself and her role. And she said that she had an elevated insight into God's secrets, and that she also understood how Holy Scripture came about. So these are very strong statements to be saying, this laywoman. But she states these points, and she goes so far as to say, nothing of these delights of God is being preached. Preachers cannot preach it. They do not understand what they preach. So that's very controversial, to say the least. So she has a strong sense of self, of what her role is, of penetrating the secrets of God and then trying to relate them to people. And she wasn't alone in her views of what her role was as this co-responsible person in the church. Indeed, we have an account of a Franciscan scholar, a theologian, who studied at Paris for 9 years. So Paris would be where the creme de la creme of clerics would go to study theology. And after 9 years of studying the scholastic theology, he said he suffered from spiritual lethargy. And as a result, he wanted to go visit Angela and be spiritually refreshed. And we have his account of this, and some of you may have heard of Ubertino of Casale, a Franciscan theologian, and in his great spiritual work, he writes of his encounter with Angela. And let me read this to you. And he says, and by his secret graces, Jesus revealed to her, that is Angela, the defects of my soul, so that I was not able to doubt that it was he who spoke in her. And all my own gifts lost through my evilness, she restored beyond measure, so that from then on, I was no longer that person I had been. And in the vigilant brightness of her inflamed virtue, she changed the whole shape of my mind. And in such a way, she beat back the infirmities and feebleness from my body and soul, and transformed my prior distractions into more excellent things, so that no one of sound mind who had known me before had a doubt that the Spirit of Christ was born in me again. wow, that's pretty, I mean, that's pretty powerful. So we get this sense, you know, we have to keep in mind that here's somebody who has the taste of scholastic theology, all well and good. The Arbor Vitae Crucifixi Jesus, where this comes from, is written in Latin. You know, he's thoroughly indoctrinated into scholastic theology, of course, but he's a Franciscan, and he's attracted to Angela's, I guess, spiritual strength. And it's probably not surprising to learn that a group of followers did grow up around her, of men and women, lay women, clerics like Ubertino, and ultimately through tradition, Angela is referred to as Master of Theologians. So quite an extraordinary character on many fronts here. Okay, so let's turn to Clare of Montefalco, the second example of this vernacular theology, this co-responsible women in the Middle Ages. She's a person who was greatly influential in her immediate life, and was also very much influenced by Francis of Assisi. However, she does not join the Franciscan order ultimately, but she becomes abbess, a cloistered abbess of an Augustinian nunnery. And so she leads a cloistered life, strict enclosure, unlike Angela, who was out and about, a laywoman. But we know a lot about Clare. Before I talk about the process of canonization, though, I feel compelled to just tell you very quickly about an aside of Clare. If you work on sanctity, if you're a medievalist, or indeed if you work on the history of autopsies, you will have come across Clare of Montefalco, because when she died, she was recognized by her sisters of her convent as being a holy person. And they set upon making a process of canonization to make the case of her sanctity. But one of the things that they did immediately after she died was that they embalmed her, because they wanted to preserve her holy body. And when they eviscerated her body, they found a posthumous miracle that was embedded on her heart. They claimed to find the miniature replica instruments of the Passion, you know, the whip, the cross, the chains, the nails, and they said that this was evidence of Clare's devotion, not only to the Passion of Christ, but her teaching of the Passion of Christ. But that's another story. If you're interested in reading about this very interesting story, Catherine Park is your woman. She has written on autopsy and dissection in Renaissance Italy. But I want to focus on Clare in this notion of co-responsibility. And we know a lot about how people viewed Clare because of this process of canonization, which it consists of several interviews by people who were witnesses of her actions, of what she said. And we have nearly 500 witnesses that give an account of the living Clare, what she was like, and also give accounts of the miracles, such as the miracles in her heart, of the replica of the Passions, the Passion of Christ. So what we do find, similar to Angela, she's visited by a number of people. She's visited by lawyers, theologians, local women seeking spiritual advice. And they would speak to her, they would go to the convent and speak to her at the grate, where she was on the other side of this screen. Remember, she's strictly enclosed, and we're told that a curtain at all times would conceal the cloister. But nonetheless, this did not stop the interaction, this community of discourse that she had with the people of Montefalco. And in particular, she really was noted for her depth of conversation. This comes up time and time again in the process of canonization. Bartolo of Spoleto tells us, a lawyer, tells us that that she often, when he would go visit her, she would say very profound, weighty things about God. You know, it's not a lot of detail. But what is interesting, I'll include here, is that he said he saw and heard many lecturers and masters of theology, and in his judgment, none of them spoke about divine matters as well as she did. Now, in the late Middle Ages, it wasn't uncommon for well-educated or wealthy people like Bartolo of Spoleto and Dante, if you know, the great poet, to attend lectures at studia given by very learned theologians and preachers to talk about really obscure issues of theology, or maybe not so obscure issues of theology, but nonetheless very learned lectures. And he's saying that he went to those types of lectures, but they didn't compare to what Clare told him, to what she said, to how she said it. So I think that's important to keep in mind, is that there are these insights that Clare and Angela are bringing to the table that these men that are writing about them or speaking about them aren't finding in other areas of the church. And so we also learn in the process that she's visited by theologians, by the people who are giving these lectures, and they say the same thing, that she's able to discuss weighty and subtle matters. And in one case, we hear about Bentivoglia of Gubbio, who was a Franciscan, and he visited Clare, and I'll simplify very much of what he supposedly said, something to the effect that since God has made us, and you know, and it's inevitable that we sin, we shouldn't feel bad or feel remorse about our actions, because God is the cause of our creation, and so whatever we do, we shouldn't really worry. I know that's a very a great simplification of what some of the things that he was saying, but this shocked Clare, and it shocked other people. And she was so appalled by what he said that she reported him and assisted in condemning him as a heretic, and in essence took part in a unofficial inquisition in getting Bentivoglia arrested and put away for life, we're told, for his beliefs. So yeah, so she's playing she's playing a huge role as well in some heavy theological discourse and discussion. And so that's something that we should keep in mind as well. Her brother gives us some insight into Clare as taking part in this community of discourse. Francis of Montefalco, her brother, says her expression was of such eloquence and virtue that the hearts of each person changed effectively, either from evil into good or from sin into God's grace if they were in sin, or from good into better if they were in a state of virtue. So what strikes me here is the similarity in tone of what Ubertino is saying about Angela, how when Ubertino goes to see Angela, how he's transformed. And Francis is saying of his sister that those who go visit her, they're touched by what she says, and there's a transformation. So there's a certain consistency, I think, about how these women shaped and influenced people in their communities. Certain images and language is being repeated. So although Clare and Angela, and we'll see Margherita in a moment, may have been refused entry into universities, they nonetheless played a role in educating people in religion, and also theologians who came from these schools and universities to get educated by them in this endeavor of co-responsibility of teaching about Christianity. Okay, so I'd like to now move on to our third and final example, Margarita of Faenza, who was a Vallambrosian nun, which is a form of Benedictine nun at St. John the Evangelist convent in Florence. I believe that that convent is no longer standing, so I couldn't find an image of it. So what we have here is Santa Maria Novella, which is another beautiful church in Florence. So it's nice to see Florence, some aspect of it. But Margarita Faenza was a nun, and she, like Angela and Clare, was a spiritual advisor. She spoke with counts and barons, prelates, monks, nuns, people who sought her spiritual advice. So again, there's this consistency we see happening in this time, and how people are seeking out, whether they're lay people or clerics or monks. You know, it doesn't. There is that consistency of wanting to see Margarita for spiritual advice. We have accounts of Margarita through Peter the Florentine, who was a contemporary, another Franciscan, and he knew Margarita and wrote a life of her. So we have a lot of detail about Margarita's interaction with these people and the way she was viewed by those around her. And we have another source, John, the rector of St. Anthony of Faenza, who was a priest and wrote about the miracles and visions of Margarita. He may have been a relative of her as well, but that is not certain. But luckily through them, we have a lot of material and a lot of sources. And in particular, we know through John's writings that Margarita, there's a lovely scene in his account of one of the meetings with her. And he pulls out a book that's in the vernacular or something, and he's going to read it to her. And she said, please get the Latin. I read Latin very well. So she makes it clear that she's very well educated. She reads Latin. So she's a very well educated nun. She's often overshadowed by her better known sister, religious sister at St. John the Evangelist, Humility of Faenza, who was famous for her preaching. And indeed, we have sermons that are still still exist by Humility of Faenza. But we're talking about Margarita today, and she was equally important in her own right. So what I'd like to just talk about very briefly are what I call visions of validation. And both Peter and John write about Margarita, write about visions that she recounted to them. That's the way they present it. And there are several scenes in their writings that deal with Margarita that show her being very anxious about her role as spiritual advisor. Because one of the things, not only is she a spiritual advisor, a woman, a spiritual advisor, but in her case, although she's a nun, she goes out of the monastery, goes out of the convent and visits people. So she's out in the streets going to the counts and the barons, the monks and the prelates and nuns, and she's not strictly enclosed. So that's interesting. And she's interacting kind of like Angela, although a nun who has taken vows. And one of the visions that she has, she's worrying about this, and she's making a decision that she's not going to go out of the convent anymore. And lo and behold, Jesus comes to her and says, I do not want you to be enclosed, but I want you to go outside and spend time with people and speak my words to these same people. And he reassures her that she has his blessing to do this. And indeed, by John the Rector writing this down, I mean, it's indicating that she also has John the Rector's blessing of going out of the convent to carry out these conversations with numerous people seeking spiritual advice. another vision of validation too, and it kind of begs the question when we're thinking about women in the Middle Ages and somewhat public discourse. I'm not saying it's exactly public, but she's going out and she's meeting with people and she's talking about religion and theology and giving advice. And so there's this indication that she is speaking, maybe carrying out a role that could, you know, kind of looks like it's encroaching on a priestly role or something to that effect. And she has another vision that is very telling, I think, about how this is dealt with and how this is rectified and validated. Let me just say is that this vision is preceded, she's praying very devoutly to the Passion of Christ. And we're told that Christ is so moved by her prayer and her feeling of devotion that he comes to her and asks her, is there anything he can do for her? And this is what she says. You know, Lord, I am a simple woman and I have to, sorry, I have to just move this. I have to keep company and speak to both wise and foolish people. Therefore, I ask that my tongue be governed according to your pleasure. Oops, sorry. There we go. Just quickly, a little bit of drama there. Here we go. Touring Italy. It's always nice to tour Italy. There we are. You know, Lord, I am a simple woman and I have to keep company and speak to both wise and foolish people. Therefore, I ask that my tongue be governed according to your pleasure, in silence and in conversation. Then Christ touched his tongue to hers, and from that moment, she received such efficiency and virtue that God was recognized on her tongue. Now that's a very powerful statement, is that Christ, she speaks the word of God being touched by his tongue. And I just would like to read out my conclusion because I think this is a very vivid image to end on. And I say, as delightful as this image is of a divine French kiss of eloquence, we should remember that this account, as well as those of Angela and Clare, point to a recognition and acceptance of spiritual counsel. The roles of Angela of Foligno, Clare of Montefalco, and Margaret of Faenza, and the support they found among like-minded men and women indicate that female responsibility for spiritual well-being was thriving in the 14th century church. Now, through the lens of the enthusiastic medievalist that I am, I would like to paraphrase the words of Pope Francis that I alluded to at the beginning of this talk and say, Angela, Clare, Margarita, and so many other women I have not mentioned kept the church alive through their remarkable devotion and deep faith. One feels today an even greater urgency to rediscover the co-responsibility that these women played in the medieval church. Thank you for your attention. I just take this down. Okay.
Thank you, Carolyn, for that wonderful talk and all of those amazing and exciting examples of that co-responsibility. Monique, are there questions already?
Oh, I just should say that if you have questions, that you can type them into the Q&A box that is at the bottom of your screen. So yeah, if there are questions that need to, that you have, just type them there. You won't be able to see them, don't worry. They are there, and we will try to get through them, but that's where you would put your questions if you have any. Thank
you. I said that at the start, but I didn't say it again. So
okay.
Thanks for reminding everybody. Monique?
We haven't any, no, we're probably just waiting for typers here.
Does that mean I get to start with my question?
Read one out as soon as one.
Yes.
I think
Wonderful,
so.
thank you. I'm so intrigued by the idea of co-responsibility, especially, I mean, I come at it with my interest in women's literary habits. So I'm really interested in that idea of the co-responsibility we see in so many medieval religious texts, either written for women or by women, and the relationship of the writer and the reader as makers of meaning. And I wonder if you see the co-responsibility you're thinking about nuanced in that way. So when I think about vernacular theology, I think particularly about literary texts, but as you so rightly point out, it's much more than that. Mm-hmm. Have you thought at all about that, or is there a way in which that relates?
Yeah, I mean, I think because it's somebody, for instance, like Angela, who has these very weighty ideas. First of all, to be trained as a scribe, I mean, it takes money, it takes time. Married women in the 13th or the early 14th century wouldn't be trained as scribes. And so their relaying of ideas would have to be dependent on a scribe, and very often that would be a man in that particular situation, I should add. And so there is a lot of interplay between women's experiences on ideas that are copied down by men, and there's dialogue and discourse within that. I think the book of Marjorie Kemp, of course, is an excellent example of that, where we have a woman who has to rely on a man to write down her lifetime experience. And she also, I think, argues a little bit with her first scribe, doesn't she? Angela argues with Brother A as they explore the depth and meaning of what she's trying to say. So that in a way creates an open-endedness, I think, to the types of writings that we come across among these women who are co-responsible. It's very dialogic, and I think that's a big part of the language that we see. I could relate to you, and I mean, you're a specialist on Julian of Norwich, and that, I think, comes across in the revelations of divine love, Julian's engagement with her experience and how she's trying to relate this to the wider community, I think comes with a desire to want to express that, to relay that, to get that across to as an open-ended discussion, as opposed to something that's closed and fixed and argumentative.
Yeah, but I was thinking of Julian of Norwich in particular, especially the idea that emerges at the end that the book isn't really complete until the readers have passed their eyes over it and applied their interpretive abilities.
Yeah.
So that's so interesting. But Monique, I think we have questions now. I won't monopolize.
We've got a bunch of questions coming in. So I'll start out. How do you suppose these women would be viewed in present times? Then we've got a continuation here. Would they be well received?
Well, I mean, the reception is in the eye of the beholder, and so it would be hard for me to say how people would respond to these individuals. That's why I very often, I think, that's why I was kind of intrigued to see Pope Francis's discussion of women in the past. And because I saw that this, women in the past, the co-responsibility, understanding them in their own terms, in their own time. I think that's probably I would say that as a medievalist, but I think that's probably the best first step in understanding them in their own context. And then trying to map that on, if you were to take it, because I think it's impossible to say how each person's going to interpret these people if they're, because their views are sometimes arcane, and what I mentioned about Angela Foligno at the outset is shocking. So I think it's very hard to say how people would respond. Although, having said that, I think what's important is the takeaway. is the fact of how involved these women were, and yeah, connected they were to the church. Oh, could I? Sorry.
Another one here. Could you please elaborate on vernacular theology?
I know that's a good question, because vernacular theology is one of these terms that it's a term and it's helpful, but it's probably unsatisfactory ultimately, because it's very difficult to try to corral all these examples of religious conversation that take place outside of a very, let's say, scholastic or traditional setting within a school or something like that. But I would say that's probably the best way to think about it, is an open-ended conversation of men and women, lay people and clerics who are interested in trying to understand God and themselves and each other in relation to one another. It's a term that's very often used in regards to mystical writings and to mystical groups, but I would say it's probably not, it doesn't exclude, as we saw with Ubertino, very well-trained theologians who are involved in this sort of discourse. Let me just type into, I know you can't, can people see? I can't. No, Eliana Corbari, Corbari, she wrote a book called Vernacular Theology. And it's about the medieval period, but it's very helpful. And that might be a good place to go to. As I said, Bernard McGinn has written on it, and so has Nicholas Watson, among many others. But it's a rich, ever-changing term.
Thank you. Can you speak to the wider context, what women are and are not allowed to officially be doing at this point in medieval time?
Right. Well, I think it's probably fair to say they're not allowed to hold ecclesiastical office. So they're not permitted to become priests or, bishops or even acolytes, as we saw. But within monasteries, we do see them playing roles that are somewhat reminiscent of this. We have sacristans in convents, so women who tend to the altar within their own convent, an enclosed setting. And we have women, I'll be speaking about this actually over the next couple of days, but we do have women who preach within their convents. So we have women as preachers, which is often associated with the sacerdotal role. We also have women who preach outside the convent too, which is kind of interesting. So there is, there are large, wiggle room, I think sometimes we see in the medieval church, where women have play roles that you may not normally expect, but you wouldn't see a woman bishop. You wouldn't see a woman priest. You wouldn't see a woman pope, but you would see these more readily, these women who are in public and also in convents giving spiritual advice to all sorts of people. That would be not shocking in the Middle Ages.
So this one says, thanks for your talk, Carolyn. I appreciate that you focused on 3 women who are perhaps less well known. I'm also wondering if you have any thoughts about Catherine of Siena, who's perhaps better known in Italy as having co-responsibility and practicing vernacular theology.
Thank you, James. A woman close to my heart, Catherine of Siena. I'm going to be speaking about her tomorrow, so that's why I didn't speak about her tonight. Yes, absolutely partakes in what we're talking about, the vernacular theology. But I would say even beyond that, I mean, she plays a role actually in the ecclesiastical hierarchy. I mean, not that she has an official role, but through the respect as a holy woman, she is, her advice is sought by Pope Gregory XI and Pope Urban. So she has the ear of the papacy. And so it even goes beyond what I would say vernacular theology. She's playing a part in the larger infrastructure of the church. So it's quite an exceptional, interesting example, and very co-responsible. I mean, she feels responsible for the sins of others, and goes to great extremes through her forms of asceticism, but also through her role as peacekeeper. She was somebody recognized as a peacemaker, and went on various missions for the papacy in that regard. So a huge figure in this, and really such an exceptional character. And that's one of the reasons why I think I didn't speak about her, but such an important person. So thank you for bringing her up, James.
Okay, next question. Thank you so much for a wonderful talk, Dr. Muessig. Do you know if in these networks that Angela de Foligno, you'll have to forgive me, I'm not going to pronounce these well, and Margaret of Faenza, and all these Italian medieval religious women and advisors, were other women involved? Do we have their epistolary, such as we do for Catherine of Siena?
Okay, I'm just going to read that again. Monique, sorry. Monique, I'm just going to read that again because your audio is just freezing a little bit, okay? So do you want me to read that? I'll read that again. So it says, do you know if these networks that Angela of Foligno and Margaret of Faenza and all these Italian medieval religious women and advisors and other women were involved? Do we have their epistolary exchanges such as we do for Catherine of Siena? Are there women-to-women spiritual exchanges documented? The later you go, all right, the later you go, the better. So if you go into the 15th, 16th century, you get more and more documentation. You get the exchanges. You get letters. You get, in fact, what's interesting, in the 14th and 15th centuries, you get women and men exchanging letters with each other in the monasteries. When women become strictly enclosed, more and more strictly enclosed, they're exchanging their views and what they say through letter writing, and also through writing sermons that look like letters as well. So there's an overlap. Yeah, the later you go, the more evidence survives, and you also have better people who are more trained, have more possibility to be trained as scribes and writers because it's more affordable to get paper and to get pens. And so we do have that. The further back you go, it gets more and more difficult to find the resources. But really from the 14th century on, and that's with Catherine of Siena, she has over, nearly 400 letters that survive. And that's indicative of something that's about to take off, that becomes more common in the later period. Yeah.
I try again here.
Okay.
For me, am I good?
You're good.
I keep thinking Angela and her wish for her family gone. Is this story more shocking, do we think, because she's a woman? I think about this in comparison to the martyrdom of Perpetua, which is quite shocking because of her sex.
Yeah, it is a shocking aspect, and it's probably something more likely that would be associated that a woman might do because of the lack of choice, let's say, of the variety of vocation. So to be a mother with children, it would be very difficult. There are exceptions. I'm thinking again of Margaret Kemp, but it's very difficult to be very set on a religious focus and devotion. I mean, there's no easy way to slice it. It's a horrible thing to do, isn't it? To pray for the death of your family. A book I have to hand, actually, this is one of the good things about Zoom. I can go to my library that's right here, is Angela of Foligno Memorial, and it's Christina Mazzoni, and she dedicates a few paragraphs to that very section of Angela's writing, and does say about the hindrance, not what we can condone this, but the hindrance and obstacles that women encountered in trying to realize their aspirations. So yes, I think it's very much related to the gender and the choices that would be open to women.
Excellent. I'm going to read out the next question here. I heard in the introduction to your talk that you have worked on other medieval women. I think that I heard the name Hildegard. If you have worked on her, would she have fit into the type of women you have explored with us this evening?
Thank you. Absolutely. Thank you for that question. I didn't speak about Hildegard as well because she's such a powerhouse output of writings of every genre. And if I can grab here, this is an edited volume of some of her works, and in them are over 50 sermons that she wrote in Latin. She's the first woman to write biblical exegesis in Latin in the 12th century. She writes, here's an example, getting back to the earlier question, we have tons of letters written by her. So an exceptional case of a woman who is writing letters in the 12th century that survive. She writes to popes, she writes to bishops, she writes to, you name it. So absolutely fits into this, but Hildegard saw herself though, I think, I think most people would see Hildegard as standing kind of outside the vernacular theology umbrella, because she's writing everything in Latin, and she's getting very much involved in the reform of the church as well. So she's probably fits, not that they're alike, but fits more into that exceptional case like Catherine of Siena does, for different reasons, but equally exceptional. And so, yes, just yet another example of the depth of involvement that these women have.
Wonderful, thank you. We have quite a wealth of questions in the questions here. We'll try to get to a few more. I'm not sure we'll get to all of them, but I'll read the next one out. Was it common for such spiritual leaders in the 13th century, male and female, to have their personal stories as opposed to their religious teachings recorded?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It was more common to have their narratives, their stories told than what they taught. And there's different theories about that, because what they taught may have been somewhat controversial. And so the men who are giving accounts of their narratives in a way are protecting them as well from criticism of potential unorthodoxy. So yes, we know more about their lives than about what they taught.
Thank you. All right, the next one. Historians have noticed that the wording of the Bible has been changed in the past, largely by male scribes, according to whatever role or authority in the church individuals would want female congregation members to have. Considering how many scribes would likely have been writing multiple copies of the Bible at one time, wouldn't it take a large group of individuals or one with more authority to alter the role of women in so many Bibles at once to make a religious/societal change, like the changing roles of women happen?
Well, it's interesting that the transmission of the Bible would have been fairly set, because it would have been based on Jerome's translation, and so those wouldn't vary. Sometimes they varied with the liturgy and words would change here and there. So it's not that you have to change the words of the Bible, it's the interpretations that become flexible and shape the way the Bible can be interpreted. So the Bible itself isn't altered. is that biblical exegesis and interpretation reflects changing times and interpretation. So that's where you look. You look for the way people interpret the Bible, not the way the Bible changes. That's where the evidence would lie.
All right, well, I'm noticing that we're at 8 p.m. and there are so many wonderful questions in the Q&A. I encourage everybody who has more to talk about to join us for the next 2 events. I think that information was on the screen at the start of our event, and I'm not sure, Courtney, Monique, will we be ending with that image on the screen perhaps, or it's available certainly on the website. And I hope to see everybody at the events Friday and Saturday. But for now, again, in our separate spaces, I invite you to join me in thanking Dr. Muessig for such a wonderful, wonderful talk. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for coming.
Good night, everybody.
Bye-bye. Bye.